Okay, welcome everyone. We just read in the Torah yesterday's Chitas about the mitzvah to write tefillin, and so we're very excited to hear from Rabbi Rabin how to best perform that mitzvah. And to spotlight your video, unmute yourself and take it away.
Wow. Good morning, Chicago. Good morning, world. What a exciting conversation we're about to dive into. I thank you, Rabbi Rappaport, for initiating this. This might be a first of its kind in terms of interactive deep dive on the intergenerational puzzle that the Alter Rebbe's Ksav is. And as I was preparing this class and the slideshow, I encountered the painful reality that this is really more like a 4 or 5 hour inquiry. So I've done my best to distill in an hour some of the most interesting and basic elements of the conversation. I'm excited to present it to you. And this is something that's deeply personal for me. The Alter Rebbe's Ksav burns in me like a fire, very strongly, very passionately. I cannot explain why, but I'm very drawn to the nuances, to the elegance, and to the details and the minutia of the lettering that is in according with the Alter Rebbe's Ksav. And it's something that I'm passionate about, something that I specialize in, something that I teach and encourage everyone to buy as well and wear. Stam, that's Torah scrolls, tefillin, and mezuzahs that are written in this script. So what is the Alter Rebbe's Ksav? Where does it come from? What are the problems? What are the questions? What's true? What's false? That's what we're going to dive into right now. So let me share my screen. Woohoo! Share sound. There's no sound in this slideshow, Elio, so we're good. Elio, does this work? All right, you guys see me and you see the screen, yes? Thank you. I want to actually get rid of me for myself. Okay, here we are. The Alter Rebbe's Ksav, an intergenerational puzzle. So before we launch into the Alter Rebbe's Ksav, which means the Alter Rebbe's script, let's just give a very basic background. Last week we discussed some of the basic halachic considerations that constitute the process of crafting tefillin and mezuzahs. Chok Toiches, Kesidron, Lishma, Hekef Gvil, cloth, ink, etc. Now, regarding the exact shapes and the exact forms of the lettering, there is very little that is specified about this in the Talmud. There are a couple of sections in the Talmud that discuss the lettering, the forms of the lettering. One section basically just says when you're writing a tefillin or a mezuzah or a Torah, you have to be scrupulous that you don't accidentally write a chaf instead of a beis, or a beis instead of a chaf. Because if you think about it, these two letters are very similar in form. A beis has a protrusion on the bottom back right, and the chaf does not. So there's just like this small little piece that determines the difference between a beis and a chaf. So the Talmud is basically cautioning us, be careful, this small little piece is actually decisive. Or don't make a resh into a daled or a daled into a resh. Don't make a vav into a yud or a yud into a vav, right? Because there are a lot of letters in the aleph beis that share a very similar form. The difference is in the addition or subtraction of one little piece. Or the difference is sometimes in the height, right? Like a vav is a little longer and a yud is a little shorter. So because of the sensitivity of the letters, So the Talmud basically cautions about a certain bunch of letters. Make sure not to confuse this one for that one for this one. So that's obviously guiding, because when the Talmud says don't exchange, don't switch a base for chaf for a base, by implication, we become aware that the Talmud considers these letters similar. And so it gives us some guidance about how to write these letters. Besides, for what the Talmud clearly states, not to interchange them, it informs us by implication of their similarity. So the Rishonim study in depth these few passages of the Talmud and extract from it quite a bit of detail about exactly how to form the letters. But even so, the Rambam rules that as long as a letter doesn't look like any other letter, and that a child is reading it and can just fluently read it, it counts. In other words, according to the Rambam at least, there isn't so much detail that one needs to be concerned about when they're writing the tefillin and the mezuzah. It's really the generality. It's really that just make sure the letter, it's obvious what the letter is. It's about readability. It's about the message. However, there were other Rishonim, especially Ashkenazic Rishonim, who, based on these passages in the Gemara and based on other Gemaras, and continues to develop more nuance and detail that they felt was appropriate for the letters. And so over time, we see that the exact font, the exact forms of the letters becomes more and more complex. The Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, who authored the Shulchan Aruch, he has many pages where he gathers together a lot of the work of the Rishonim, where the Rishonim are kind of developing the exact forms of the letters. And what emerges from this work of his to gather all of this together is what's called the Ksav Beis Yosef, the font of the Beis Yosef. This has become today the most widespread font amongst the non-Hasidic Ashkenazic Jews. Interestingly, the Beis Yosef was a Sephardi himself, and all of the Sephardim follow his rulings in the Shulchan Aruch over the rulings of the Ramah, Rebbe Moshe Yitzhak, who was the Ashkenazic arbiter of halacha. Nevertheless, when it comes to the exact letter formations of the tefillin and the mezuzahs, most Ashkenazim who are non-Hasidic Ashkenazim actually follow the Beis Yosef's rulings about how to form the letters. And the Sephardim actually, for the most part, have a script called a Velish. And their script goes back, we find this script Velish seems to be the oldest script actually. It has, to date, there are scrolls that 800 years old, 1,000 years old. They're all written in this Velish script. So the Sephardim seem to have a more unadulterated tradition of writing the letters that wasn't didn't continue to become developed in a very sophisticated way. And so they all continue, a lot of the Sephardic communities continue to use this script Velish. And then you have the non-Hasidic Ashkenazim who use the script of the Beis Yosef. And of course, in the same time as the Beis Yosef, this is in the 16th century, early 16th century, or late 15th century, you have the Arizal, the great Kabbalist Arizal, was living in Tzfas. Actually, the Beis Yosef as well was living in Tzfas. They were both living there in the same time. And so the Arizal came along, and based on the Kabbalah, based on this esoteric awareness and teachings of the kind of the interiority of Judaism and of the halacha, the Arizal suggested some modifications, some changes to the script. So the Arizal script is based largely on the Beis Yosef, meaning it contains within it a lot of the detail that the Beis Yosef curated based on the Rishonim, but there are some deviations that the Arizal suggests to make based on the Kabbalah. So until the time of the Alter Rebbe, you basically had three fonts. The Velish font, which was used by the Sephardim going back centuries and centuries and centuries. The Beis Yosef Ksav, which kind of emerged from the Beis Yosef gathering and curating the words of the Rishonim, in which they all kind of develop more of the minutia of the forms of the lettering. And you had the Arizal's Ksav, which of course became used by the Kabbalists, by anyone who was a mystic, mystics, Kabbalists, anyone who was inclined more to spirituality, to the esoteric dimension of Torah, was going to use the Arizal's font. Now, we'll look at some of the distinctions, some of the exact differences. Some, it's too much to look at all, but we'll look at some of the differences as we go through these slides. Now, the Alter Rebbe comes along and ostensibly crafts or designs a new script, a new font. Now, it's obviously important to understand I'm using the word font because just like when you're using a computer, you can have multiple fonts, but they all are the same letters inherently. It's all the same language and it's the same characters, but different font means that they're designed differently. So the same way, the Alter Rebbe comes along and creates a different font of the Aleph Beis that deviates, that's different than Velish, then the Beis Yosef, and then the Arizal. Now, the legend of its origin first appeared in a book printed in Warsaw in 1900. It was called Emunas Tzadikim, and was later reprinted. It was retitled to Kahal Hasidim HaChodosh. And this is a storybook, has about 200 Hasidic stories that the author received from various sources. And in this book, the story is said as follows: that the Alter Rebbe of Shnei Zalman of Liadi, one time when he was with his teacher, the great Maggid of Mezrich, who was the successor of the Baal Shem Tov, he was there for quite some time after Sukkot because he wouldn't leave his Rebbe until his Rebbe would give him permission to do so, until his Rebbe would call him and bless him and send him on his way. So there was this one time that he was there, and some time passes and his Rebbe didn't summon him. And this took a while until finally the Maggid calls him and says, there's a great kitrug in the upper world. There's a great prosecution, a great crisis in the upper worlds, spiritually speaking, that is, that the approach of the Talmudists and the approach of the Kabbalists to how the lettering is meant to be formed clash. This is what the Maggid tells the Alter Rebbe. There's a crisis on high because the Kabbalists and the Talmudists are basically knocking heads against each other for the precise form of the lettering. And therefore, you need to take time and delve deeply into the words of the halachists and the Talmudists and the Kabbalists, and you got to straighten it all out. You have to straighten out this divide and create some cohesion and integration so that this integration can actually prevail throughout the cosmos and throughout consciousness so that this crisis can be resolved. The Alter Rebbe went ahead and got to work, and he crafted a font that embodied within it and integrated within it both the perspective of the Kabbalists as well as the perspective of the Talmudists, and he brought his work to his Rebbe and he showed it to the Maggid. The Maggid thanked him and told him that in this time, the crisis has been averted, and from the next day and on, the Maggid began to wear tefillin in this, that were written in this font. And the Maggid sends the Alter Rebbe off. This is the story, this is the legend as it appears first, like I said, in a book printed in 1900, which is a solid 125 or 30 years after the story could have even have occurred. And this is kind of the way the story ends in this book. From then on, this is the font that becomes accepted and a standard to use across the board. The story has a little bit of an interesting continuation, where it says that the Alter Rebbe was traveling home and he was traveling through Anipoli. And over there, he would stay by the sofer, whose name was Reb David. And he comes over to Reb David's house and he sees that Reb David is writing tefillin in this exact script that he had just crafted from scratch and presented to the Maggid. And so the Alter Rebbe asks Reb David, how in the world, who taught you this? Who showed you this? He said, oh, well, Reb Zusha, we know Reb Zusha was a contemporary, a colleague of the Alter Rebbe. He actually gave an approbation on the book of Tanya. He said, Reb Zusha approached me and taught me this font and told me that the Maggid is going to be beginning to wear tefillin in these font. So he taught it to me and he asked me to prepare tefillin for him. So that's the way the story goes, where obviously Reb Zusha intuited that there was this new emergence of this particular font, and that the Maggid would begin to use it, and that this was the font that was meant to begin to be used in the service of the mitzvah of tefillin and mezuzah, etc. That this was the new emergence. So the story continues to appear throughout different Hasidic storybooks subsequent to its first appearance in Emunas Tzadikim in 1900. The question is it verified anywhere in Chabad sources? So there was a great mashpia and Kabbalist who lived in Montreal. He was originally from Poland. He survived and came over and was sent by the Frierdiker Rebbe to Montreal. His name was Reb Wolf Greenglass. He was also involved in Stam. He was a sofer, and he had heard this story from a certain Rabbi Stern in Montreal in the 1940s. Actually, Rabbi Stern printed a storybook himself called Chutim Mishulashim, where he writes the story. And Rabbi Greenglass hears this story from Rabbi Stern and writes to the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, writes up the story and says to the Frierdiker Rebbe, have you heard of this? Is this true? Is this reliable? So the Frierdiker Rebbe responds to Reb Wolf that the story that you've written to me in your letter, I heard it over 50 years ago. This is in 1946. So basically the Frierdiker Rebbe is saying, I heard it in 96. So this actually precedes the printing of the book of Emunas Tzadikim in 1900 or more. So he says, I heard it over 50 years ago, or like around 50 years ago. I've actually retold the essence of the story at the Yutis Kislev Farbrengen this year. It was already 1946. The Frierdiker Rebbe is already in America. The reason, the Frierdiker Rebbe says, the reason why the Maggid asked the Alter Rebbe to arrange this new font in accordance with the opinion of the Kabbalists in the way of Chabad is because when the Alter Rebbe came to the Maggid and he came there to stay as his student, so then the Tikkun of Chagas was complete and it was time to work on the Tikkun of Chabad until Moshiach would come. I don't understand fully what this means, but I think it means something like it was time for the tefillin are put on the head from there, our minds are meant to influence our heart. That's why we have it on the hand as well. And it seems that from the time that the Alter Rebbe, who was an intellectual, who was a Litvak, and who would go ahead and establish Hasidic, kind of like more of an intellectual or conceptual Hasidic philosophy, not just like a mystical or experiential, not merely like experiential or emotionalistic Hasidism, but more conceptual, philosophical Hasidism as well. So it was time for the Alter Rebbe. The Maggid felt that it was time to begin a new revelation, a new emanation, and so he asked the Alter Rebbe to do this. So we have this verified by the Frierdiker Rebbe that the Maggid indeed appointed the Alter Rebbe to craft a new font. And here he doesn't exactly say that it was in order to merge the opinion of the Kabbalists with the Talmudists. But again, there's some spiritual precipitus for the Alter Rebbe creating this font. Now, here, there's a letter of the Frierdiker Rebbe where he writes this letter to Rabbi Aaron Axelrod, who lived in Baltimore. And the Frierdiker Rebbe writes as follows. Your father, Rebbe Moshe Axelrod, was a sofer, and he was a chassid of the Rebbe Maharas. And the Rebbe Maharas very much appreciated him. And he said that he was the third receiver of all of the aspects of writing Stam since the Alter Rebbe. Because Reb Moshe Axelrod learned from Reb Zundel, and Reb Zundel learned from Reb Ruven, and Reb Ruven of Yanovich learned from the Alter Rebbe. So here, a little bit of the history is now showing up here in the letter of the Frierdiker Rebbe, that the Alter Rebbe crafts a new font based on the instructions of the Maggid. He then goes ahead and teaches it to Reb Ruven of Yanovich, who was the sofer that the Alter Rebbe used. He was a chassid that the Alter Rebbe taught him not only the exact font and the exact script, but he also taught him a special ink recipe that would last for a very, very long time. It would last black, and it would have a good adhesion to the cloth. And Reb Ruven of Yanovich teaches it to Reb Zundel. Reb Zundel teaches it to Reb Moshe Axelrod. And this brings us up to about 1840, when the Frierdiker Rebbe is actually born. The Frierdiker Rebbe continues to say that in 1840, the Rebbe Maharas wanted to commission a Sefer Torah, and he actually chose Reb Moshe Axelrod to go ahead and write the Torah. So we now have a picture of this tradition, of this script, starting with the Alter Rebbe, and we certainly have it going now in 1840, which is actually when the Frierdiker Rebbe is born. Now, so just to recap, legend of origin, we got verified by the Frierdiker Rebbe and the chain of tradition. Now, it's important to note that Reb Ruven survives the Alter Rebbe and continues to live on in the lifetime of the Mittler Rebbe. And this doesn't mean to say that there weren't anyone else. There were no other students of Reb Ruven or no other Sofrim who were practicing this font. But this we know for certain, that the Reb Ruven of Yanovich teaches it to Reb Zundel. Reb Zundel is practicing Stam in the time period of the Tzemach Tzedek. Reb Moshe Axelrod receives it from Reb Zundel. He's practicing Stam in the time period of Rebbe Maharas. And Tov Reish Mem is 1880, right? Sorry. So as late as 1880, we know of the Alter Rebbe's Ksav being used and actually being written by a sofer who receives it in a direct chain going back to the Alter Rebbe. 60 years later, in the 1940s, the Frierdiker Rebbe begins to probe for detailed instructions on the script. It's interesting because I heard from Rabbi Klapman, who's a sofer in Crown Heights, that he heard it directly from Rabbi Yisrael Jacobson, or his teacher heard it from Rabbi Yisrael Jacobson, who was a chassid of the Rebbe Rashab and the Frierdiker Rebbe, that the Rebbe Rashab once said, "Weis mir a sofer was kennt Alter Rebbe's Ksav." Bring me a sofer that knows the Alter Rebbe's Ksav. So there seems to have been some weakening in the tradition right around the mid-1880s. Maybe around the time of the passing of the Rebbe Maharas or the passing of Rebbe Moshe Axelrod, the Rebbe Rashab himself actually relocates from Lubavitch to Rostov during the time of the Bolshevik Revolution and World War I. So it could be that it was during this tumultuous time. The Rebbe Rashab himself was, for the first 10 years after his father passed away, did not really assume the role of a Rebbe in a very official way. There was like a little bit of a weak link in the continuation of the Chabad institution until the Rebbe Rashab did assume officially the role of being the Rebbe and established Tomchei Temimim. So it seems that some time between 1880 and 1920, which is really mostly the Rebbe Rashab's time, it seems that there was a breakdown in the exact continuation of this tradition, such that in the 1940s, the Frierdiker Rebbe is probing to find out detailed instructions of the script. Meaning, okay, we have this story, and we know that it was passed down generation to generation, and now the Frierdiker Rebbe is like, okay, do we have exact details for what constitutes this script? Exactly how is the Aleph meant to be written? Exactly how is that Beis meant to be written according to this script invented by the Alter Rebbe? So there's a chassid Reb Zalman Gerari who goes ahead and he has a set of tefillin that, in his understanding, was actually written by Reb Reuven himself, the first recipient of the Ksav, of the script from the Alter Rebbe. He goes ahead and submits these parshias to the Frierdiker Rebbe and says, here's a work written by Reb Reuven. So it doesn't get better than that. We have original work from Reb Reuven, who received the script from the Alter Rebbe. Now, the pictures of these parshias are first printed in a Torah journal called Yagdil Torah in 1979. The main image that you see here on the screen in white was exactly how in this Torah journal 1979, this is the first time that the public is seeing images of these parshias, which were presented to the Frierdiker Rebbe for inspection 30 years or 35 years before. So it was photocopied. The name of Hashem was taken out. As you can see, there's blank places. The blank spots were where Hashem's name was. They didn't want to print it with the God's name in the Torah journal. And it was also shrunk. So you see this very grainy, unclear image. Now, it's interesting to point out that the Frierdiker Rebbe inspected the scrolls, and he said, I'm not sure if these were written by Reb Reuven himself or by his student, who wrote exactly like him. But the reason why the Frierdiker Rebbe was not sure about it was not because of the script itself, because as the Frierdiker Rebbe said, and it's printed, the Frierdiker Rebbe said that his student wrote exactly like his teacher. But the Frierdiker Rebbe was not sure about it because he wondered if the quality of the ink was actually the same as that which Rebbe Reuven used, because, like I said, Rebbe Reuven received an ink recipe from the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe was a bit of a chemist. The Alter Rebbe was, in general, very hands-on involved in a lot of different domains of halacha. For example, he innovated a new technique in shchita, not a technique in shchita, but he innovated a new kind of knife, a double-edged blade instead of just a single-edged blade that he innovated and instituted for the sheikhtim to use. Or he was involved in, he was very hands-on in a lot of different domains of halacha in determining what were the sizes, certain sizes that the Talmud talks about, determining what were those sizes or measurements and contemporary measurements. So he was also involved, clearly was involved in the chemistry of the crafting of the ink. So the Frierdiker Rebbe wasn't sure, based on the quality of the materials, if this was Rebbe Reuven's or his students. But from the perspective of the script, the Frierdiker Rebbe says the student wrote exactly like the teacher. So these then do become a reliable source for us to study and to become informed on the exact properties of the script. The trouble is, with a photocopy like this, it's impossible to see anything. Well, lucky for us, 1979, fast forward 40 years, and we have smart technology and digital technology. These tefillin are passed down from Reb Zalman Gurari, who passed away some 15 years ago, to his son, who lives today in Monsey, New York. His name is Rabbi Nosson Gurari. And Rabbi Nosson Gurari brings them to the local sofer to be inspected from time to time. Remember, these are 200 years old. These are priceless today. Either they're written by Rebbe Reuven himself, the sofer of the Alter Rebbe, or else they're written by his students. Regardless, absolutely priceless artifact. And he brings them to be inspected from time to time to the local sofer. The local sofer says, hey, I got to shoot pictures of these. So we're lucky that now we have these exquisitely clear images of what is either the original work of Rebbe Reuven or else of his student. So first or second generation Alter Rebbe's script. The top and the bottom are the same exact scroll. The top is how it was printed in the Torah Journal Yad Torah in 1979. What's underneath is a picture taken with a digital camera just a couple of years ago. If you don't believe me, take a look at this word Ksav here. Can you guys see my my mouse moving? I can't hear anyone. So, Leo, could you see my mouse moving here?
Yes, we see your mouse moving. It does seem unbelievable that those two are the same thing.
Yeah, isn't this something else? So you see this word Ksav. You see how this tough is a little bit stretched, and this is stretched even more? Well, here you go. You see it exactly the way it is here. And you see how the Kshartam protrudes a little bit out to the left beyond this word. Here you see it right here. So these are the exact self-same parshias, except in the new one here we can actually see what's going on. So great. So this is great news. We have in the world today original tefillin written in the Alter Rebbe's script that were either written by Rebbe Reuven or by his student. The Frierdiker Rebbe confirms it. And we now today, in the 21st century, have digital images of it so we can study it and compare it and analyze it. So everything is dandy. Not exactly, but we'll find out soon what are the complications. But for a minute, let's just take a break and start looking at, based on everything we know until now, we know that there's a script of the Alter Rebbe. We know, based on the legend, that it has something to do with merging or integrating the Kabbalist perspective and the Talmudic perspective. So on the right, we have the font of the Beis Yosef. On the left over here, we have the font of the Arizal. I want to point your attention to the ayin. Okay, right here is an ayin. And right here is an ayin. Can anyone, I don't know, okay, you guys can't talk, I guess. I'm going to show you the difference. Here is the
And you
difference.
can unmute. People can unmute.
Okay, good. So,
Right there. Yeah, whatever.
can anyone see the difference between this ayin on the right and a corresponding ayin on the left?
Yeah.
What's the difference?
Mr. Ross, let's go ahead.
What's that?
Speak up.
The crown.
The crown.
Okay, besides for the crown, anything else?
The left side is a vav or a zayin.
Right. So you see here is the ayin of the Beis Yosef. Notice how right here, the left shaft appears as a zayin. That means this head crosses over both sides of this shaft. Here on the left is the font of the Arizal. The Arizal said, no, I want this shaft to appear as a vav. So this head does not cross over both sides of the shaft. So this is a classic discrepancy between Bet Yosef, Arizal. The non-Hasidim will use this. The Hasidim will use this. Comes along the Alter Rebbe's Ksav, and this image is taken straight out of these original parshiot, these Reb Reuven's Ksav. Now look what we have here. Look at the relationship between this head and this shaft. First of all, notice how this shaft over here is on a steep diagonal. Whereas here in the Bet Yosef and here in the Arizal, they're both very vertical. However, you should be aware that until World War II, or until the 1900s, almost all fonts actually shared this in common. Meaning, in old school Bet Yosef, this shaft would have been written diagonally. And in old school Arizal, this shaft as well would have been written diagonally. The fact that these are straight is more of a contemporary development and has become standardized after World War II, because now with communication, global communication, so there's so much more standardization in the font, in the exact way the scripts are written. So let's just say that this was universal to have this diagonal. But look at the relationship between the way this shaft comes in and meets this head. On the one hand, the shaft meets this head kind of at the right corner, which shares a similarity with the Arizal script of the shaft coming in at the right. But at the same time, this head is written in such a way that it is rounded over here and protrudes well to the right of this. That shares a similarity with the Bet Yosef, who has the head protruding to the left and to the right. So when we see this in the work of Rebbe Reuven, in the work of these tefillin, we immediately say, this makes sense. This is consistent with the legend that we have. This is consistent with the original story, that the Alter Rebbe is trying to do something that merges the Talmudic perspective and the Kabbalistic perspective, some kind of integration, right? So it's kind of like a vav. The fact that this is rounded is also vav-like, but the fact that it still protrudes over to the right of where the shaft meets the head is Zion-like. So that seems to be some kind of compromise. So this is, in a very general sense, our way of understanding what we're looking at when we look at Rebbe Reuven's work. Here is another example. The shin, same exact thing. Bet Yosef right here, the left shaft is like a Zion, in which the head protrudes both to the left and to the right of its shaft. The Beis Yosef, above. The Alter Rebbe's Ksav, same exact phenomenon. We have the diagonal here, and we have the shaft coming in to the right side of its head, but the head is rounded in such a way that it protrudes well over to the right side as well. However, the theory and the approach that the Alter Rebbe's font is this perfect synthesis or compromise or integration of the Bet Yosef and the Arizal breakdown it breaks down, first of all, in the tzaddik. The letter tzaddik in the Bet Yosef, we see the same thing here. The shaft and the head on the left side are like a zayin, according to the Bet Yosef. The shaft and the head on the left side are like a vav, according to the Arizal. The Alter Rebbe, same compromise, right? Shaft comes in all the way to the right side, and still the head protrudes very, very substantially over to the right. So it's a bit of a compromise. However, look at the right side of the tzaddik. According to the Bet Yosef, this is an ordinary yud facing forward. According to the Arizal, this is a backwards yud facing backwards. How do you do compromise? A compromise between these two would have been to have the shaft coming into the center and have this head protrude a little to the right, a little to the left. Well, no such thing in the Alter Rebbe's Ksav. Who is this consistent with? That's a question, guys. Is this consistent with the Bet Yosef, or is this consistent with the Arizal?
Arizal.
Right. So here we see, ain't no compromise over here. The Alter Rebbe leans entirely on the side of the Arizal with this. So this theory of the Alter Rebbe's Ksav being a compromise starts to break down. Furthermore, let's take a look at the letter Nun. The letter Nun in the work of the Bet Yosef and in the work of the Arizal is identical. Okay, the letter Nun is one letter, one of the many letters that the Bet Yosef and the Arizal agree on. And both have the shaft coming in the center to the head. And so the head protrudes to the left and to the right in both the Ksav of the Bet Yosef as well as in the Ksav of the Arizal. Well, here is Rebbe Ruvain's work. Take a look at this Nun right here. We see that Rebbe Ruvain does the exact same thing that he does with the ayin and with the shin, where the shaft comes in all the way to the right. Yes, this is rounded and it protrudes over to the right side. But we see Rebbe Ruvain doing this thing that until now we thought was a compromise between a vav and a zayin. We see him doing this in a letter that the Bet Yosef and the Arizal both agree on. Both agree that the shaft should come out from the center. So what's that about? Furthermore, this exact detail that appears in the work of Rebbe Ruvain is actually confirmed in a responsa of the Tzemach Tzedek. The Tzemach Tzedek clearly references this because this is a significant deviation, it seems, from what it says in the Talmud. The Talmud says, make sure that you do not exchange a long nun, an end nun, and a zayin. You see right here, the word bain. We have a long nun at the end, right? That's how a long nun appears in the tefillin. The Talmud says, make sure that you don't interchange a long nun and a zayin, right? How would that be? By simply making the foot short. Now, we see over here that a long nun has the head protruding on the right and on the left, and the shaft comes into the center. In general, there's a principle that there's no difference between the long nun, or the long letters, and the short letters, except the length, which would imply that a regular nun should have the same exact formation of the head going over right and left and the shaft coming into the center. The only difference is this is extended very long, and this one here folds over to the left, creating a base. Still, we see in the Alter Rebbe's font that Rebbe Ruvain writes this head of the regular nun differently than the head of the long nun. This is radical. The Tzemach Tzedek references this and confirms it. In bestam shalanu, in our stam, ra'isi, I have seen, hanun kfufa, the ordinary nun, As Maram Galanti wrote that it's kind of Vav-like over here, where the shaft is coming in all the way from the right. A Zion, usually a Zion, the head of it goes over both sides, and the shaft meets its head in the center. As opposed to our nun. So the Tzemach Tzedek clearly articulates this feature of Reb Ruvain's work. And this, like I said, it no longer seems to be some kind of compromise between Beis Yosef and Arizal, because they don't even spar over this. Both the Beis Yosef and the Arizal have their nun's shaft coming in straight out of the center. Here's another thing. Check out this mem. Where's my mouse? Can't see it. I don't see it on my mouse. Oh, here it is. Check out this mem. This is an ordinary mem. The back side of it is rounded at the top. Now here is a mem at the end of the word. The back top right is squared. Again, so we see a distinction between the ordinary mem and the mem at the end of the word. This one is rounded, this one is squared. This seems to have nothing to do with creating a compromise between the Arizal script and the Beis Yosef script. There's two that Tzemach Tzedek refers to. The Fitz hamem bestam shalonu hamem psucha agula l'mayla l'tzadimin v'hamem stuma merubas b'zavis mikol tzdodim. So at this point, we can no longer assume the theory that what characterizes the Alter Rebbe's Ksav is compromise or merging between two fonts. Furthermore, the Rebbe in 1954 writes a letter to Reb Wolf Greenglass in Montreal. And he says, this is a while that I've responded to Rabbi Yaakov Zilberman. Rabbi Yaakov Zilberman was a very storied sofer who lived in Montreal. He wrote this book, Chilus Sofrim, the book that you see here in the bottom right corner. It was actually just published. I literally just got it for the first time right here. It was just published 30 years posthumously. He was a sofer that worked in Stam for 5 decades, whatever it was, 6 decades. And he actually had a manuscript that was never published, and it just came out a few weeks ago. So the Rebbe says to Reb Wolf, I recently responded to Rabbi Yaakov Zilberman regarding the exact forms of the Alter Rebbe's font that he sent me, and I've asked him if he could find someone who is a direct recipient, who has a direct chain of tradition for how the letters are meant to be formed, not only what we see in Reb Ruvain's work. Why? Because when we look at images of Reb Ruvain's work, we still don't know what is precisely exactly instructed to him by the Alter Rebbe. What is random or accidental? That means to say what is simply a function of Reb Ruvain's distinct penmanship. And even what is accidental, meaning sometimes a person is not a machine. So when a person is writing stam, something can happen that will make him form a letter in a particular way, but it's circumstantial that he's doing that. It's not necessarily because everyone was told to do that by the Alter Rebbe, but it was circumstantial. He had to make something shorter, or make something longer, or make something more narrow, make something more fat to justify the lines. The cloth was bad in that area, whatever. When you're looking at a work, you don't know exactly what the circumstance was that may have precipitated something that you're seeing. Oirak l'shem hidur, or that which is a hidur, so it's not essential to the font, it's only a kind of addition, a beautifying addition. So here the plot thickens. We know that there is a font that was crafted and innovated by the Alter Rebbe. Not only that, we know that these parshias that Zalman Garari showed the Frierdiker Rebbe are indeed written either by Reb Reuven or by his student who wrote identically to him. Furthermore, today in the 21st century, we have digital images of them, and we can study them in unprecedented detail. Still, there's a bit of a breakdown. because we don't have an exact tradition of exactly what constitutes the script and what doesn't. Why does that matter? We have images. Well, it matters because when you're looking at an image, first of all, there doesn't seem to be a theory that would explain everything about it, as I just pointed out. Second of all, when you're looking at images, you don't know what exactly was instructed by the Alter Rebbe as essential, what is a beautifying addition, and what is simply circumstantial to that cipher and that piece of work at that time. So that's where we're up to. That's where we're up to. Without a clearly laid out tradition of what exactly constitutes the Alter Rebbe's script, we're left with images of Rabin's work or his student, but the initial theory is difficult to trace perfectly throughout the script. In the other aspects, it deviates from qualities shared by both the Arizal and the Beis Yosef. We can't know what is simply on purpose, what is random, what is accidental, and what is hidden. Someone's volume is on, by the way, so we're hearing you. Now, I want to point out at this point, wow, I can't believe it, Elio. We're going to have to go a little bit over. I'm trying to move a little faster. I want to point out at this point, these are pictures of the Friedrich Rebbe's tefillin. They're written in the Alter Rebbe's script. So there's no question. Nowhere do we see the Rebbes tell us not to use the Alter Rebbe's script. As a matter of fact, the Rebbe ongoingly encourages people to use tefillin and mezuzahs that is consistent with the Chabad script. The Friedrich Rebbe himself, that we have pictures of his tefillin, is wearing tefillin in the Chabad script. However, what it does mean is that the sofer who writes it needs to accurately copy Reb Reuven's script. Because if you can't copy it accurately, right now, given that we don't have an exact tradition of what constitutes the exact script and what is an add-on or what is circumstantial, the best way to capture it is by copying Reb Reuven's script completely, as accurately as possible. Then you know for sure you got it. This requires significant awareness, skill, and halachic aptitude. The halachic aptitude that's needed is that you need to be aware of the nuances, and when Reb Reuven does something, you have to be aware of the halachic considerations around it and make judgments about that, which if we have time, I'll be able to give some of the details of that. Now,
at the end, will there be, when you finish, maybe let's open for a few questions, but I think it's important to first finish the presentation.
Okay, sure.
You're going to look at the megillah, I assume.
Now, the Rebbe Maharas, here's where we're going to go. Now, the Rebbe Maharas, the fourth Rebbe of Chabad, was a sofer. The Rebbe himself wrote a book about the Rebbe Maharas, a biographical sketch of the Rebbe Maharas. And the Rebbe writes, he was an expert sofer. He wrote a megillah for each of his three sons. The one that the Friedrich Rebbe owns, in other words, the Rebbe Maharas wrote one megillah for each of his three sons. That would be Razah, Rebbe Menachem Mendel, and the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab would pass on his megillah as an heirloom to his son, the Friedrich Rebbe. So the Rebbe writes, the one that the Friedrich Rebbe owns, the Ksav is gorgeous and clear as if it was just written. Then the Rebbe points out, not all of the columns begin with HaMelech, and the 10 sons of Haman appear at the top of a column, not in a column on their own right. There are also mezuzahs written in his script. This is what the Rebbe writes. And he prints a picture. There's the picture that the Rebbe prints, 2 columns of the Rebbe Maharas's Megillah. I assume that the Rebbe prints 2 columns to demonstrate 2 of the qualities that he pointed out. Number 1, not all of the columns begin with HaMelech. So you can see this column right here, it starts with the word Hamadina, it's not HaMelech. And this 10 sons of Haman are put at the top of a column. They don't occupy an entire column. This is printed in 1947. It is a grainy, miniaturized image and very difficult to see anything. Now, Fitz Rabin goes along to the library of Aguch, where this megillah is stored, because he wants to see better images. So this megillah lies in a showcase, but with a digital camera, I'm able to get images that are certainly superior to that. These are the two columns that the megillah is open to. I shoot some pictures so that I can study it in greater depth. Now, from this picture, we see something extremely peculiar. If you can take a close look at this nun right here, what do you see? This nun does not appear at all like the nun of the Alter Rebbe's font. The shaft comes straight into the center of the head. Same thing here. So I'm looking at these megillas, and I'm quite confused. Did the Rebbe Maharas not write in the script of the Alter Rebbe? Not only that, the nun, out of all things, his own father, the Tzemach Tzedek, clearly identified as being written more like a vav, where the shaft comes out not from the center but from the right. And the Rebbe Maharas deviates from it and writes differently. And I began to study more and more and noticing more and more that this megillah does not seem at all to be written in the font of the Alter Rebbe. But then there's something else that I noticed as well. The megillah seems to be very, very blotchy. I don't know what you see over here, but from my perspective as a sofer, who's used to looking at the handwritten work, when I look at this work, it's very, very blotchy. It looks like amateur. And this really puzzled me for a long time. Both the fact that it's not really written in the Alter Rebbe's script, and as well as the fact that the script seems to be very amateur, like written like very unprofessionally. And so I began to inquire about it. And here's what I found out. I was told that when the Frierdiker Rebbe came to America, this megillah was in terrible disrepair. Came in 1940. The megillah was a minimum of 100 years old, and it was in bad disrepair. So, sorry, not 100 years old, no. It was a minimum of 65 years old, and it was in bad disrepair. He gave it to a sofer in Brownsville to fix, to reupholster. The sofer was not familiar with Alter Rebbe's font, and he knew that he was doing work for the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and so he wanted to do the best work that he possibly can. And he went ahead and went over the whole megillah, and he basically doctored it. He fixed, in his mind, he was fixing it. In his mind, he was upgrading it so that the Frierdiker Rebbe would have the best possible megillah. But in that process of his so-called upgrading it, the megillah lost its authenticity. So in a lot of ways, it was kind of changed from being Alter Rebbe's Ksav into being more like the ordinary Arizal's Ksav. And that would explain both why it's not written in the Alter Rebbe's Ksav and also why it seems a little amateur, because it was originally written very nicely, but once you go over someone else's work and you start tampering with it, so it takes away the clarity and it takes away the sharpness, and it begins to look a little bit like patchwork. That story made a lot of sense to me, especially because there's actually another megillah. This is, by the way, another image of it. I don't know if you can tell, but it doesn't look very professional. It looks really noisy. So this made a lot of sense to me, because there's actually another megillah written by the Rebbe Maharas that exists today, and it's in the property of a certain Karlbach family. This seems to be the megillah that the Rebbe Maharas had written for his son Razzo, Reb Zalman Aron. Reb Zalman Aron had one son who was epileptic, and he was cared for by a certain Zalman Schneerson. And in appreciation for the care, and also as to kind of just like keep the megillah in the family, Razzo gave this megillah to Reb Zalman Schneerson, who passed it on to his children. And so today there's a family that owns this megillah. Until recently, there was no good images of the megillah available. I went ahead and arranged with the family to take digital pictures of it. So that's what you see here. This is the megillah that appears in the library, the one on the right that we've been just talking about. The one on the left is the one owned by this private family, this other megillah written by the Rebbe Maharas. Way clearer, way sharper lettering, and indeed it is written in the Alter Rebbe's Ksav. If you can see, take a look at this nun right here. You see how the nun, the shaft, comes in at the right. And the head of it is rounded and protrudes to the left. So we see over here, Rebbe Maharas wrote the Alter Rebbe's Ksav. This is a beautiful megillah. It's clear. It's sharp. Now we have beautiful images of it. By the way, these images are up on the website, my website, yeshivastam.com. And the story makes sense. The trouble with the story is that I told you the Rebbe writes that this megillah that's in the possession of the Frierdiker Rebbe, Ksav Yofe Ubohir, the script is beautiful and bright, as if it was just written. And the Rebbe writes this in 1947. If this story is true, that the megillah was in bad disrepair, and that's why the Rebbe, Frierdiker Rebbe, gave it to a sofer to fix, why would the Rebbe write in 1947 that this megillah is in perfect condition, so to speak? So I don't know. Could it be that the Rebbe didn't know that? Could it be that I don't know. I don't know. This story that I've heard and the Rebbe making this statement puzzle me. The story makes sense because number one, the megillah is not in the Alter Rebbe's Ksav, and number two, it's clear to anyone who's familiar with the craft of writing stam that the megillah is doctored. It's clear that it's splotchy and it's amateur looking, which is a function of being doctored. But the Rebbe articulates that it's like in perfect condition. So I don't know how those two go together. So this is a conundrum even within the universe of the Rebbe Maharas's work. By the way, it's important to dispel another myth. Some people say that the Rebbe Maharas was really only writing to exercise his hand, and you can't really learn much from the work because it wasn't necessary. He wasn't necessarily trying to be precise. This is silly. First of all, the Rebbe writes clearly over here that the doctors told the Rebbe Maharas to use his hands, and to that end, he built a table, he built candelabras, etc., etc. He built mosaics. Then the next paragraph, the Rebbe says, seemingly completely not related, that he was an expert in stam. So I think it's a mistake to conflate these two things. Besides, for those who say that you can't learn much from a megillah, the Rebbe writes clearly that he wrote mezuzahs as well, although we don't have them. This does remain a puzzling piece in the picture. Why the megillah that's in the Aguch library that the Frierdiker Rebbe received from his father, that was written by the Rebbe Maharas, is not the Alter Rebbe's Ksav and is badly doctored, while the Rebbe writes in 1947 that the megillah is in great condition and it looks as if it was written today. Maybe the Rebbe meant that the ink is still black. I don't know. Interestingly, there are discrepancies between the two megillahs itself, not only in the font, but also in the spellings. If you take a look over here at the word aridai, there's a yud right here between the resh and the daled. That's in the Karlbach one. If you take a look at the word aridai over here, which is the one in the library, there's no yud. And there are similarly a few other spelling discrepancies between the two megillahs, which is interesting. Also, the way he formatted it. Here, all 10 sons of Haman are stacked evenly and justified, one on top of the other, except for Parshat Dosa, where the aleph protrudes. Here, he didn't stretch any of the letters, and he just wrote it naturally. So the letters kind of protrude and recede just as they come. So these are just interesting discrepancies between the two megillahs themselves. Some used this megillah on the left, the Karlbach megillah of the Rebbe Maharas, which is clearly undoctored and clearly the Alter Rebbe's Ksav, as their guiding light for what constitutes the Alter Rebbe's Ksav. Others use Reb Reuven's Parshas of Tefillin as the guiding light. There are some subtle differences between the two. And again, it's difficult to know when you're looking at either one, what was precisely instructed by the Alter Rebbe and essential to the Alter Rebbe's script, and what was circumstantial, and what was just hither. To conclude, here are images of Reb Reuven's Ksav, gorgeous, gorgeous images and beautiful, beautiful lettering that we use to study from. In my own practice of Stam, in my own work in writing Stam, I strive to copy Reb Reuven as accurately as possible, something that I've been largely successful with, Baruch Hashem. And then we have the Rebbe Maharas's megillahs that some follow. And on the left, I curated the aleph beis from the megillahs, just to show you, finish off with a couple of important details. I said before that when you're buying the Alter Rebbe's Ksav, you have to buy it from someone who is skilled and also aware and has halachic aptitude. Here's an example why. The Yud in general is supposed to have a protrusion that points downwards on the bottom left. You can see that on the left side of the page. Here in Reb Reuven's Ksav, look how he did it. It doesn't protrude downwards all that much. It really protrudes out to the left, but not downwards. This is a big halachic discussion. Now, Reb Reuven himself was not perfectly consistent in this. Here you see one Yud where it protrudes out to the left. Here you see a Yud where it actually protrudes downwards. It's on an angle down. Here, it's hard to tell. 3 Yuds on the page. So this is why when someone is copying Reb Reuven's Ksav, it really requires a lot of discernment. The way I write my Yud is I make it pointing slightly downwards, like this. And I know that I'm in integrity with Reb Reuven's work because Reb Reuven himself does this plenty of times. It's just interesting to note that sometimes it is pointing downwards and sometimes it's not. And that is very, very interesting because if we would know clearly that the Alter Rebbe dictated that it doesn't need to actually be pointing downwards and that by protruding out to the left is sufficient, then I would take the liberty to write it that way as well. But without having a clear tradition clearly specified by the Alter Rebbe, I don't take that liberty, even though Reb Reuven did it. And of course, it begs the question, why did Reb Reuven do it? Obviously, Reb Reuven had an interpretation of the halacha that to him meant protruding out to the left, it kind of has a look like it's facing downward, is sufficient, is akin to it actually pointing downward. Or in Reb Reuven's eye, it appeared as if it was pointing downward. So it's very hard to know, but here's where you get into some of the minutia that if you're going to buy the Alter Rebbe script, which Chabad Chassid should, there is a lot of minutia and sensitivity that is required. And that's one of the reasons why the Alter Rebbe script is so expensive. And the more skilled the cipher, the more expensive it is. Here's an example of a discrepancy between Reb Reuven's Ksav and the Rebbe Maharas. They both share the same core shape, the end men being square at all 4 corners. But there's a stylistic difference. Reb Reuven, and not only do they both have a square corner on all 4 corners, they also share in common this quality that the left shaft here is thinner than the right shaft here. You see that very clearly here in the Rebbe Maharas. The left shaft is thinner than the right shaft. Still, there's a stylistic difference here. This is thin and then has this very significant kind of protrusion here, this base protrusion. And the Rebbe Maharas, it's much more subtle. So I think when we're looking at a discrepancy like this, it's really just a stylistic difference. Rebbe Maharas's quill kind of produced a letter like this. Reb Reuven was a little more fancy and nuanced. Fundamentally, we're looking at the same letter. We're looking at the same structure. This would seem to be just a stylistic difference. But then again, without an exact tradition, when we're just analyzing work from the outside, we can make our best guess, but we can't know with absolute certainty. So There's no halachic difference between these two. It's just a stylistic difference. Either way is fine, but there does remain a kind of openness, a room for interpretation in the Alter Rebbe's Ksav until today. And that's what we will end with for
Thank
now.
you. You didn't show the how does the Rebbe Maharas's Yud compare to the Rebbe Reuven's Yud?
Same exact thing. Some and some.
Do we, and by we I mean you or anyone, whatever.
Take a look. 1 second. Just want to say, like, take a look here in Bayoim.
Right. There's
The Yud, it protrudes out to the left. But in Hashvi, it does point downwards. So it's some and some.
Do we have access to clear images of the entirety of both of those megillahs to compare everything to? Like you compared spelling of Arisai, like
There are photo stats of the whole other megillah, not high resolution images.
is that not something that's doable these days?
It is. I would need to approach Bar 11. It's just it's money. I mean, this project of photographing the Rebbe Maharas' megillah cost me $2,000 that I paid for it myself.
So the pictures that everybody has now of the Kalabach Megillah, that comes from Rabbi Rabin himself?
The ones you're looking at, the ones on my website, if those are the ones being disseminated, yes.
Okay, there was some questions, but I think some people left, so we'll have to get
Are any other megillas written in this Ksav? Are any other megillos written in this Ksav, or is it only Megillah Esther?
only Megillah.
Only Megillah Esther.
Any other questions? Okay, I think thank you so much. It was fascinating, and we continued, I guess, at some point.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Rappaport, and thank you to everyone for joining.